This is Better Together. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 2. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 4. Chapter 6. They look like they grew up drunk. Wyatt set his hedge trimmers down beside the first row of Scotch pine and pulled his gloves out of his back pocket while scanning the cloud-free early morning sky. The sun sparkled on the clear water of the pond, which lay in the dip, 200 yards away. Maybe that's how they got their name, short for Scotch whiskey. Wyatt had spent enough time on the farm to know they grew fast, and because of their deep taproot, were drought-resistant, which made them a favorite of growers. But compared to a Douglas fir or a balsam fir, Scotch pines looked more like untamed octopuses than the proper cone-shaped Christmas tree. Maybe that's why they were his favorite, too. It originated in Europe, probably grows well in Scotland. Harper's eyes swept over him. Lines appeared between her brows. Where are your safety goggles? We're trimming trees, not welding. He stopped at the end of the first row, admiring how different she looked in her long-sleeved shirt, jeans, and work boots. Not studious. Not today. Welding. She paused before walking to the next row. The grass brushed the tops of her boots, and he made a mental note that it needed to be mowed. Snakes loved to hide in it, and he didn't want Harper getting bitten. You know, with a rod about yay long. Wyatt stretched his gloved hands out. I know what welding is, Harper said. Never mind. She shook her head, then adjusted her goggles and pulled her gloves on. He started his hedge trimmer. Harper started hers. He pulled the trigger playfully, making revving sounds. Harper rolled her eyes. He waggled his eyebrows at her. She gave him her serious, I'm gonna whip your donkey look. He loved that look. Holding up 3 fingers, he waited for her nod. He put 1 finger down. 2. Then another. 1. Waiting a beat, he fisted his hand. 0, before squeezing the throttle and starting on the tree in front of him. In the row beside him, Harper did the same. How many times had they done this together? The last few summers he'd been off roaming the world, but before that, Harper and he had spent a lot of time trimming trees. They'd even raced before. And Harper was right, he did tend to sacrifice shape for speed. Well, not today. Today, his trees were going to be perfect, and he was still going to beat her. The scent of pine filled the air along with needles and small branches that flew from the blades of their trimmers. Like riding a bike, the proper angle and diagonal motion came back as easy as breathing. The buzz of the trimmers drowned out any other sounds, making his vision shrink to just the tree in front of him. Although he never lost the awareness of Harper behind or beside him. He kind of wished they weren't racing, because he loved watching the serious look on her face, the way her eyes sized up the tree, the way she handled her trimmers with skill, and her feminine grace despite her jeans and boots. A cloud passed over the sun, and without its heat, the day turned cooler. Ominous, almost. He moved to the next tree, glancing at Harper, still 1 tree behind him. Taking a quick look at the rest of the row, he estimated that they weren't quite halfway. Plenty of time for her to catch up. He widened his stance and willed himself to move faster. She could beat him at this, easily. Always could. His problem was simply that he got bored and distracted. His problem in tree trimming, his problem in life. Well, He'd given up his Europe trip for the summer. He'd struggled with the decision, but once it was made, he'd been fine with it, especially seeing that Harper had made her own hard decision. That decision, however, had cemented in his mind that Harper would never belong to him. He'd always known that the farm meant a lot to her. So, if he was going to fulfill his mother's dream and his dad's desire, he had to be in Chile. There was no compromise. He'd told his buddies earlier this spring that his wandering days were behind him. He hadn't planned to say that, but as the words were coming out of his mouth, he realized that it was true. He was ready to settle down and grow roots. Problem was, his dad wanted those roots in Chile, and he'd always wanted his dad's approval. Craved it. He didn't even know why. It wasn't like his dad had ever wanted him before. Now that he was an adult, with experience and talent, his dad had begged him to move to Chile. Wyatt wanted to say no, just desserts and all that. But there was something inside of every kid who wanted his parents to be proud of him, wanted to please his parents. Plus, back when he was a kid, his dream had been to run the resort. He'd never gotten over that. Even though his mom had died 10 years ago, he knew it would make her happy for him to work with his dad. She might have been a farm girl from Iowa, but she dragged him all over the world, sometimes as a freelance journalist, sometimes on the arm of some rich man or another. Sometimes she worked her way. Entertainment on a cruise ship, scuba instructor in Australia, even a zookeeper's assistant in San Francisco. Eventually, she'd gone back to Chile, to his dad, claiming she was settling down, that she wanted her son to know his father, wanted her little boy to be just like his dad. Then she was killed in an avalanche, and Wyatt's dad didn't have the slightest idea of what to do with him. So he bought him a plane ticket to Pennsylvania, where Uncle Fink, his mother's brother, lived, where Harper lived. He snipped one more bulging area before moving on to the next tree. Maybe he should be grateful to his dad. After all, if his dad had kept him, he would never have met Harper. Of course, being in love with a woman who only saw a clumsy kid, and maybe a sense of humor, wasn't exactly easy. The buzzing of his hedge clippers became louder. It sounded angry. He'd checked the oil, sharpened the blades. What could be the problem? He glimpsed a huge, brown paper-like ball, a hornet's nest, inside a branch of the tree he was trimming. Harper jerked on his shoulder as hot pain ignited in his cheek and hand. "Run, you crackerhead!" Harper shouted. She yanked on his arm again. Dropping his clippers, he pushed her shoulder, altering her direction. "To the pond!" he yelled. He shoved her forward. They sprinted toward the pond. A black cloud of angry insects buzzed above Harper's head. He didn't see any on the back of her light shirt. Pain burned in his own shoulders where he'd been stung through the thin shirt material. His cheek stiffened as though he had a wad of cement in it, and his hand stung. Still running at full tilt, Harper reached in her back pocket and took out her phone, dropping it in the grass. That was a good idea. Wyatt unhooked his from his belt, getting a finger stung in the process, and dropped his as well. They had almost reached the pond. He'd swum in it several times over the past decade with Harper, although neither of them really liked to, since the bottom was soggy mud and a film of algae covered it most of the summer. Not now, thankfully. Too early in the season. As they flew down the last steep hill, he yelled, "Shallow dive!" The pond was only 4 to 6 feet deep. A steep dive would be dangerous. "Swim under the surface to the willow on the other side," he shouted as they careened wildly down the hill. The branches hung gracefully over the water. They might offer some protection from the furious hornets. She jerked her head in acknowledgement without breaking stride, although she did slant him a microsecond look that said things like this happened uncommonly often when she was with him. She looked forward and didn't catch his answering grin and shrug. Just as well. The innocent look probably didn't come off well when a person was flat out sprinting away from a swarm of angry hornets. They reached the edge of the pond, still sprinting. The buzz of hornets filled the air. Their black bodies careened around his head. He took a deep breath and jumped a fraction of a second after she did, watching her. She hit with the shallow angle she needed to, and he splashed in right beside her. The cold water shocked his system, and he allowed the power behind his jump to glide his body forward, while he took several seconds to adjust to the completely new environment. Although he couldn't see much in the murky water, he could just make out Harper's leg beside him. Her work boots must have been getting waterlogged, because her body looked like a ship going down. His own feet were getting dragged to the bottom. The pond wasn't deep enough to worry about drowning, so he didn't work to take the boots off. Rather, he allowed his legs to drop and push in a slow-motion run against the bottom of the pond, staying under, still heading toward the willow. Harper did the same. She flipped, rolling in the water until her back was down. With his lungs burning, Wyatt copied her motion, allowing only his nose and mouth to come out of the water, blowing like a whale, then sinking back down, turning and heading in the direction of the willows. Harper grabbed his arm. Her ponytail floated in wispy strands around her head. Her cheeks were puffed out from holding her breath. She pointed slightly to the right, correcting his course. He didn't think he was that far off, but was hardly in a position to argue with her. It turned out she was right. They broke for air the second time directly under the overhanging branches. "This is not my fault," he panted. "No one blamed you for anything. Although, if you're defending yourself before anyone has accused you, it sure makes you look guilty," Harper puffed, pushing her hair out of her green eyes. "You definitely don't look like a professor now." "Staying alive took precedence over being dignified." Harper peered through the hanging branches. "There's a cloud of hornets hovering over the water." "I see." A cloud was an apt description. "They don't look like they're giving up." "Angry and stubborn. The absolute worst characteristics a hornet can have." Her teeth started to chatter. Harper never could handle the cold water. "Intelligence would be bad, too." She snorted. "Yeah, they'd have found us by now." "Gotta look on the bright side, Pickles." "I just ruined a $200 pair of work boots. I've got pond scum in my hair and hornet stings on my back, and you're telling me there's a bright side?" "Sure. You get to hang out with me." "This is not hanging out." "Good point. We're gonna lurk in the murk. We'll start a new trend. Too bad we can't take a selfie." "Yeah, that would definitely make it worse if my phone were lurking in the murk with me." Positive thinking phrased as a negative, even if you do look like a drowned ostrich. "Ostrich?" "Your neck's looking kind of long today." Slender, graceful. "When you're not around, nothing like this ever happens to me." Her teeth were chattering so hard he was afraid she might be in danger of hypothermia. "No wonder you're always so happy to see me." "I'm happy to see you because for some odd reason, I like you." "You're cold. Come here." He moved toward her in the shallow water, putting one knee down on the pond bottom and planting his other foot, making a seat with his leg for Harper to sit on. She floated toward him, dodging the hanging branches, and sat on his leg. He pulled her closer to his chest. Her entire body shook with chills. "I'm sorry." The words came out on a croak, and he cleared his throat. "It's not your fault. You know I was teasing." "I know, but it does seem like I make you miserable." "You make me laugh." She smiled over her shoulder. "Wow, your cheek is swollen like a balloon." She brought a hand out of the water to touch it gently. The cold on his face contrasted nicely against his tight, hot skin. If only he could close his eyes and allow her to cradle his cheek in her hand. He pushed the thought away. "Hurts." "I don't recall you being allergic to hornet stings." Lines crinkled her forehead. "Me either." Her lip pulled back. "Did you get stung anywhere else?" He held up the finger that had gotten stung when he pulled his phone out. It was swollen. "Being in the cold water must be helping that," Harper said. "Anywhere else?" "A couple on my back, my arm. It's my face that hurts, though. Maybe I got more than one there." She squinted at his face. "Looks like maybe the stinger is still in there." "What about you?" "If I'm stung, my adrenaline hasn't subsided enough to allow me to feel it yet." She chuckled softly. "I haven't run like that in years. I might not be stung, but I'm going to be sore tomorrow and completely worthless." She chuckled again, not as softly this time. His heart sang at the sight of her smile, even if her chattering teeth made her face look like it was vibrating. Maybe she liked adventure more than she let on. "You're gonna chip a tooth." "Lots of people live without all their teeth." "You'll never catch a husband if you chatter your teeth off." "That's fine. I don't exactly have the husband-catching net or hook or whatever equipment it takes to snag a guy." Oh, yes, she did. At least for him. She'd never even had to try, but she had hooked him almost since the first time he'd seen her. "I think the way to a man's heart is supposed to be through his stomach." "Well, my doctorate's in nutrition. That should give me an edge." "Or not," Wyatt said. "What's that supposed to mean?" she hissed. Luckily, the hornets had started to dissipate. "There's the way you got your nickname." "Those pickles were good." "I hope so. You gave a jar of pickles to everyone for Christmas. And when I say everyone, I mean you were passing them out on the street. The grocery store stocker, the preschool janitor, complete strangers. It was my first Christmas with you all, and I'd never met anyone who gifted people with pickles." Harper huffed. "That year, our cucumbers produced like rabbits on fertility drugs. What was I supposed to do? Let them go to waste?" "Might have thought about it." "Ha! My Scotch-Irish ancestors come back from the grave and cut the toes off little girls who waste things." Wyatt adjusted Harper closer to him. Her shivering had him worried. "And you stopped believing that story when you stopped believing in Santa Claus." "My mom didn't do Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, but I know all about ancestors with knives." Harper smiled playfully, and Wyatt's gaze caressed the laugh lines around her eyes and the way her mouth crinkled up. "Wow, and I thought I had a rough childhood." "Scarred me for life. That's why I have to cook to get to a man's heart." Harper snuggled in closer. "I think each successive degree diminished your cooking abilities. At this point, you'd probably try to explain to your potential husband that steamed bugs raise your good cholesterol and improve overall heart health. Harper nodded.
They actually do.
Yep, Pickles. You need your teeth. The cooking ain't gonna do it for you.
Very funny, Wyatt. Plus, I don't know why you're trying to marry me off. You just lost your chance with Raina and Sugar. You sent them off to Europe with that handsome Rex.
They were connected on social media, so of course she knew who his traveling companions were going to be, although he didn't think Harper had ever met Raina or Sugar in person. You think Rex is handsome?
If you're into the whole chiseled jaw and sculpted muscle look.
Wyatt rubbed his jaw. So you dig me, huh? She snorted, which came out with a kind of grunty click.
I thought it was the bee sting making your cheeks swell. Now I realize it's your ego leaking out of your brain. I'd get that checked if I were you.
You wound me.
You're gorgeous, Wyatt. Everyone knows it. I don't know why you're fishing for a compliment from me. I'm just the bestie. I'd still think you were great even if you were as ugly as a tire fence.
His chest heaved. Harper had called him gorgeous. He clamped his mouth shut over the words that wanted to come out, to return the compliment, tell her she was beautiful, that he'd hoped to take her to the Alps with him, that she was the only one he wanted with him as he commemorated his mother's death. He tried to keep his reaction hidden and said casually, You think I'm great? Better than Rex? She nodded.
Even with your face swollen and pond scum in your teeth.
I have pond scum in my teeth? He really didn't give a flip what he had in his teeth, but if it made Harper laugh or eased her mind, he'd play along.
Some kind of blackish green goop. Makes you look a little like a swamp monster.
Man, if only I'd have known that 30 minutes ago. I could have scared those hornets away by smiling at them. He glanced between the willow branches toward the dissipating cloud of hornets.
That's great. I can't wait to be warm again.
Here, let me up. I'll get out on this side and see if they notice.
No,
she wailed playfully.
I don't want to lose your heat.
A small sacrifice now will mean heat and warmth sooner. He imitated her most scholarly tone, although he really didn't want to let her go. But her chattering teeth concerned him.
Would you stop being the voice of reason?
She shifted so he could straighten.
I'm not used to it coming from your lips.
He tapped her nose, then pointed to the hornets. Watch for them to swarm us again. Be ready to duck under the water.
I'm ready.
He gave her a last look, praying the hornets were gone and they could get out. Her lips were blue, her face pure white, and her shivering not as violent, which he knew was not a good sign. He pushed through the water, dodging the willow and carefully pulling himself out of the pond. He stood, then took a few steps to the side so he could see around the tree. No hornets. He turned back. Harper was already pulling herself out of the water. He bent to help. Harper reached for Wyatt's offered hand. She was shivering so hard she missed it the first time. She'd be fine, though. Shivering was good. It was Wyatt's face that bothered her. She'd studied allergies and knew enough that his swollen face made her nervous. The rational side of her brain said if he was going to have a fatal reaction to the hornet stings, it would have happened by now. But there was still the danger of his airway being swollen shut. And there was also that outlier reaction, the one that didn't follow the rules. Wyatt could die. For the last 20 minutes, she had been trying not to panic. He couldn't know she felt that way. She didn't even want him to know she was worried about his face. She pressed her lips together. Sliding up the steep bank of slippery mud, Harper held tight to Wyatt's hand. "Do you think you can walk to the house?" Wyatt asked. With the deep crease in his forehead and the pinched skin around his eyes, she didn't have the heart to pretend to be worse off than she was.
"I can."
As stubborn as he was, she wouldn't be able to get him to the hospital. Maybe he didn't really need to go. Probably he didn't need to go. But the idea of losing Wyatt froze her insides more solid than the cold water ever could. At least the swelling on his face didn't seem to be getting any bigger.
"I'd like to avoid the tree with the hornet's nest in it."
By at least 6 miles. "Yeah," Wyatt grunted. "I like adventure, but I've had enough for an afternoon."
"For a lifetime."
"Oh, no, not that long." She laughed. Wyatt's arm came around her shoulders to keep her close, warm her up. A little twist of panic stirred in her chest at the thought that he might find out about these new feelings she had for him. She had to play it cool. She loved him as a friend, but it was impossible to deny that there was more going on. For her. If it was friend love, she wouldn't have been tempted to put her lips on his neck, to trace the strong line of his jaw, to lean against the hardness of his chest, although she would probably still be every bit as tempted to knock him over the head with a hard, blunt object and drag his body to the ER. Of course, killing him kind of defeated the purpose of an ER visit. They didn't say much as they searched the grass for their phones, then made a long, looping detour around the tree with the nest and closed the distance to the house. Harper didn't trust herself to speak. There was nothing like surviving a dangerous situation with her handsome friend to loosen her lips about her true feelings. She couldn't let him know, so she kept her lips clamped shut, which also kept her teeth from chattering out of her head, and trudged stoically to her apartment. He removed his arm from around her shoulders to open the door. "I'm all wet and hate to come in. Will you be okay?" She nodded, her fingers going to the buttons on her shirt. Only she was shivering so badly she couldn't grip them.
Maybe not."
She scrunched her face and glanced at Wyatt, expecting him to have some smart-butted comment to direct at her. Instead, his eyes were wide open, his jaw hung down, and his facial expression looked similar to the way she would expect if she'd suggested he sacrifice his firstborn to the corn god. Was she that repulsive to him? Seriously, it wasn't like he loathed her. They were best friends.
"Never mind. I'll just rip it off."
She tried to get her shaking hands to catch hold of the collar. Wyatt coughed. "No, His voice came out 2 octaves too high. Harper would have laughed if she wasn't so close to crying. So much for thinking he might return her feelings. He cleared his throat and reached for her hand. "I can help."
"I wouldn't want to stress you out or anything,"
Harper muttered, resisting a little as he grabbed her wrist. "I can make the sacrifice." She kept her eyes on the floor. His fingers grazed the skin at her wrists. "Let's do these first," Wyatt murmured. Not wanting to admit that made sense, she kept her face turned down. Her stomach did a slow roll as he slipped the button through the hole. "Give me your other hand." His voice sounded low, almost tender. Harper complied, trying to pretend her breath hadn't grown faster and that his near rejection hadn't hurt. He cradled her wrist in his hand, and this time she watched as his blunt thumbs skimmed over her skin, then worked the button through the hole. Her small apartment seemed to compress, the air heavy, the silence thick. Her lungs shook, causing her inhale to shudder. Her heart beat so loud her cheeks flushed as she imagined he could hear it, and could know exactly what he was doing to her. "Come closer so I can get the rest of them." She swallowed, but didn't look up.
You don't have to.
He tugged on her hand and she moved in front of him, waiting. "I'm sorry, Harper." Gosh, did he have to make it worse by apologizing? She shook her head. He couldn't help it that he hadn't wanted to touch his friend like this. She wouldn't want to undress any of her colleagues at work.
It's not your fault.
I'll, close my eyes." His voice sounded like sandpaper lined his throat.
It's okay,
she whispered.
I have a shirt on under this one.
His fingers hovered under her chin, like he was going to say something else. He touched the button. "I can close them anyway." Heat smoldered through her shirt. She wanted to whimper, to throw herself into his arms, to demand that he stop treating her like his sister, but she gritted her teeth, fisting her hands at her sides.
"Just hurry."
He seemed to gulp. His hand slid down to the next button. His fingers worked it free. Her shirt slid open, revealing more of her white cami. She watched as though it were happening to someone else. Wyatt's hands on her shirt, brown and tan against the blue outer shirt, the white inner one. The hair on his arms curled crisp and dark. So tempted to touch it, she shoved her hands in her back pockets. Her front brushed his arm. He jerked. Her heart stuttered. The room seemed to shrink. His breath skimmed across her skin. "Hold still," he growled. She froze. The last button slipped out. Wyatt didn't move. She glanced at his face, ready to apologize. His neck was red, his cheeks flushed, and shiny pearls of sweat glittered on his forehead. Her heart thumped as they stared into each other's eyes. He spun on his heel and plunged out the door. He didn't look back as he powered through the yard and disappeared into the farmhouse. Harper released her breath. She spread her hands out in front of her and looked down. Steady as a rock. Wyatt might not stop running from her until he hit the next continent, but at least her shivering had stopped. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.